Hey Internet, today we're going to be talking about compression. And of the three main tools that we have as sound people to affect our recordings to get the result that we want, mainly reverb, EQ, and compression, compression is probably the least straightforward and hardest one to understand. And hence I also think it's the hardest one to begin to use effectively. So we're going to quickly talk about what it is, all the different parameters that you control with it, and just get a basic understanding of what compression is. So I have a quick PowerPoint that I put together, and let's go through it. All right, so to start off with, let's first think about how compression affects something. Depending on what we're compressing, the end result can be very different. So first off, I have a couple examples here, starting with a drum loop. It's going to play a phrase for 4 measures, uncompressed, and then it's going to play those same 4 measures again with compression enabled, and then it'll do it one more time. So without me giving away what it is, let's just play it and see if you can just pay attention to yourself and see if you can tell what the difference is, or how would you describe it. And now compression. And now without compression. And then compression one more time. So when I hear that, the way that I describe the difference is the drums seem closer, the drums seem punchier, and I tend to hear more detail between a lot of the transients or loudest moments in that recording. So it can have all of those effects of adding punch, of bringing things closer, they just feel and seem physically closer to you, as well as increasing the amount of detail. So that's an example with a drum loop. Now let's listen to a bass synth. And same thing, it's going to play through a phrase with the bass synth on its own uncompressed. And then we're going to add compression. And I'll talk about how I view or would describe the difference between these examples. Now compression. So for me, when I hear the bass synth compressed as opposed to uncompressed, I feel like the compressed version again has that sensation of being closer to me, closer to the listener. It has less range or difference between the loudest and quietest moments of that passage, or dynamic range, which we'll talk about a bit more as we get into this presentation. And then also it draws attention to the more granular distorted quality of the bass itself, right? So it's a sense of space, it's a sense of loudness, and it's also a difference in texture for me, and difference in timbre or the color of the sound. All right. Last example is a string section, and for this one, I just want to tell you from the get-go what the difference is, or at least how I perceive it, because that way you can listen for it, because I think it's the hardest one to hear between all of these. So for this passage, it is a string section, just usual SATB, or violin, viola, cello, and bass, or you can think of it as SATB, solo, or soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. And it's traditional block chords moving for the most part together. And the first time it plays through without compression, the violins are carrying the melody, and everything is backing them. When we begin to add compression, however, it draws attention to some of the inner voices, and particularly the cello. You can hear the cello and the specific movements and notes of the cello much more prominently when it's compressed as opposed to uncompressed. So I'll play this so you can have a listen. now listen to the cellos the second time. For me, there are a lot of moments where the cellos begin to overtake the violins in terms of prominence there, especially when we have some of that chromatic motion or half steps in the cellos. So it can draw attention to different voices within your audio file or different details about them. It can change them both timbrally. It can create a sense of being closer to the listener or farther away if you're not compressing other things. So compression can do a lot of different things. So what is compression actually doing? Well, essentially it's reducing the difference between our loudest and quietest moments, or what's called our dynamic range. In this example here, we have a threshold of, let's say, negative 15 decibels. So we're working on a digital system. We're 15 decibels below whatever our loudest possible sound is. It's probably somewhere up here. But we've got our threshold of negative 15 decibels, and when we apply compression to it, it essentially reduces all of this content above here. So once we apply compression, the end result is this signal down here. So you see the shape pretty much mirrors this, except everything above that negative 15 decibel mark has been cut off. Basically took a pair of scissors and just cut it off right there. So pretty extreme form of compression. But that's at its core what it's doing. So if that's what it's doing, other than some of the cool effects we've listened to, what are some other reasons to use it? Well, one is loudness management. As you see, it lowers the transients and decreases our dynamic range. So it can take audio files that would be very difficult to work with because they're very loud and very quiet moments that you want to capture, and make them a bit more manageable in terms of loudness. So we avoid clipping and can still hear all of the quiet moments in our signal. It can also help create hierarchy. Certain elements can be compressed, which again brings them forward. It helps give prominence and priority to certain elements, and then we can apply different amounts of compression or not apply compression to other elements to put them back in the mix. And again, it can also change timbre. So if we want something that's a bit more punchy, or we want to hear more detail about something, maybe we want to use compression in order to achieve that. If you use Pro Tools as your DAW, this is going to be the default compressor that Pro Tools has. I just thought I'd throw it in here because Pro Tools is the DAW that everyone is at least familiar with, even if it's not their favorite DAW. And I also like their compressor because it doesn't have any additional weird knobs to it. It doesn't have funny names for stuff. I know I've seen third-party compressors out there that have like a punch knob or a sparkle knob and stuff. And I'm sure there's a ton of macro settings that those knobs are changing when you tweak them, but like having like a punch knob or a sparkle knob means nothing to me. I have no idea what it's doing. All of these settings here in Pro Tools, I know exactly what they're doing. And I'm going to go through all of these settings with the rest of this presentation. So first off, we have threshold and ratio. So in our previous example, everything above negative 15 decibels was having compression applied to it. So the threshold is where we're going to begin to apply compression. Things above this line will have compression applied to them. And the ratio is how much compression is going to be applied. So in this example over here, I have an input level of 20 decibels. So we've switched from DBFS, like negative 15 decibels as in a digital audio system, into analog, or just in the realm of acoustics. So we're actually talking about quantifiable sound pressure level here with decibels. But if we have a decibel level of 20, and then we go above that, right? So we're adding more to this, so it's getting louder. The actual output level here on the y-axis changes depending on the ratio of compression that we're applying. So if we didn't apply any compression at all or had a 1-to-1 ratio, this is what our end signal would be. All right, so for every 1 decibel above our threshold, we would actually output 1 decibel above our threshold, right? It wouldn't be affecting the signal at all. However, if we have a 2-to-1 ratio, that means for every 2 decibels over our threshold, we're only actually going to allow 1 decibel through in our final signal. So if we had, say, our signal at 30 decibels with a 2-to-1 ratio and a threshold of 20 decibels, our end signal would only be 25 decibels. Because again, our original decibel amount is 30. We're essentially cutting that in half. For every 2 decibels over, we're only allowing 1. So instead of 10 decibels over 20, we're only allowing 5 decibels over 20. So our end output would be 25 decibels. And then you just apply the same sort of math calculations here, 4-to-1, 8-to-1. So if our signal was 28 decibels, we would only be allowing, our end result would be 21 decibels, because instead of 8, it would only be 1 decibel. Then we also have this option here, infinity to 1 or limiting. This is an extreme form of compression and essentially does not allow anything past whatever our threshold is. You can get some very cool, interesting results if you do limiting, but depending on how much you're making your limiter work, you can also get some terrible, awful, extremely distorted results. But if you hear about compression versus limiting, that's the difference. They're the same thing, it's just limiting is an extreme form of compression. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is attack. So the speed at which compression is applied after the threshold is reached. In this example, you see here our original signal, and down here is our signal after we have applied compression. So anytime that we have compression and we cross our threshold, compression is not instantaneously applied. There's a certain amount of time it takes before compression is actually applied to our signal or fully applied to our signal. And these are very short measurements of time. We're talking milliseconds. But if you'll see in this example down here, I would guess that the threshold is probably around this area because it takes a certain amount of time after we cross our threshold to have our compression applied, right? And this small amount of time here, again, milliseconds, is our attack. So then compression is applied down here, which means our threshold, I'm guessing, is somewhere in this area. So we cross our threshold, it takes a certain amount of time for compression to be applied, and that is our attack setting. Then we have our release setting, which is almost the exact opposite of attack. So we cross our threshold, and it takes a certain amount of time for compression to be applied, while release is we have been above our threshold, and then we drop below our threshold, and it takes a certain amount of time for compression to not be applied anymore. So if we look at the differences between these in a signal over time, you'll see here the blue line is our original signal. The dotted line is what actually ends up being output after compression is applied. So while we're below our threshold, they're both the same. We then climb above our threshold, see, right here, and then it takes a certain amount of time for compression to be applied. So even though our input level's up here, what's actually output is shown here in the dotted line. So it takes a certain amount of time for compression to be applied. That goes on for a bit, and then our signal drops below our threshold, right? Again, blue line is our original signal. So it drops below our threshold, compression is still being applied at this point, and then the release is how long it takes for compression to not be applied anymore. So attack and release, yin and yang, basic opposites of one another. And then we also have a knee, or what a lot of plugins and other folks call a Q. And this is how severely we're going to be applying compression and how severely we treat the threshold as when we apply compression. So right now we've been talking about compression in terms of a hard knee, or there's a threshold, a certain level, and compression is either being applied or it's not. and it's completely dependent on whether or not it's above or below that one line, and that's it. When we have a knee, if you'll see right here, even though our threshold is up here, we're actually beginning to apply a little bit of compression down here, and even when we reach our threshold, we're not fully applying compression until we're significantly past it. What this does, it gradually applies compression based on the input level, and this can make the compression not as apparent. If you say have a signal or a passage that is constantly going above and below your threshold, if you had a hard knee, so again, compression is either on or off, there's no kind of massaging into it either direction, then it can be very obvious to the listener that something is different. There will be noticeable hiccups when you'll hear the compressor essentially kicking on and kicking off repeatedly over and over again. If you apply a knee, then you are gradually applying the compression, and it's much less noticeable, and it makes it much more transparent while still giving you the benefits of loudness management and possibly changing the timbre and whatnot when you use compression. So again, if you have a compressor and you constantly hear it kicking on and off and it gives a very stuttering sort of effect, I would play with your knee or Q setting to see if that can take care of it. Lastly is makeup gain. So after we've applied compression to our signal, essentially just changing the loudness of our output there. Right here you'll see we don't have compression, so like louder moments, louder moments, louder moments, right? Makeup gain is not important from the standpoint of the loudest moments of the signal per se, but it's primarily important because look at the difference between the quietest moments with no compression versus the quietest moments with compression applied. Like the loudness of these loud moments or transients are pretty similar, but these quieter moments are significantly louder than what we started with. So this helps us, again, manage loudness and hear more of the detail of all of these quieter moments that maybe we couldn't hear so well with our original signal. All right, so tips and tricks for using compression. If you're looking at mixing music or doing something where you suddenly want certain elements to be important and then fall to the background and have the priority shift. You can automate the use of compression for different phrases. So when certain things come in that you want to draw the listener's attention to, you can then apply compression to those things and not apply it to other elements. You can use different ratio values or essentially apply different amounts of compression. It's also great if you want something to punch through a mix. Again, it gives a sense of something being closer and makes something sound more punchy timbrally. And the biggest thing is to just direct the listener's attention, right? They hear something punch out, they're going to pay attention to that, and they won't necessarily hear that something else became less important and fell into the background of the mix. How to mess it up. Don't do these things. Applying too much compression. So like limiting is an option, but it really should just be a slight band-aid as opposed to a real solution for anything that you're doing. If you apply too much compression to anything, you're going to get distortion and it's going to sound awful. But even before you have distortion, you may lose some of the natural breathing quality of the sounds, and it just won't have as much of a spacious or natural feeling to it. So don't just throw a compressor on anything and everything. Have a reason why you're compressing something before you just throw a compression on it. Otherwise, your audio is going to sound very unnatural and just not good, really. Another way to mess it up is to not think about how it interacts with other effects and your signal flow. Knowing what order in which you are doing things matters. If you have reverb on audio before you're compressing it, you're then essentially making the reverb characteristic much more prominent than it would be as just a reverb affecting a signal. And there might be some really cool creative things that you can come up with that, but if you're going for a sense of realism and placing something in a space, that may not work for you. Also, if you're compressing something after an EQ, that may be negating what you're doing with the EQ. Like if you just think about having white noise where everything is the exact same level and then you bump up certain areas of the frequency spectrum and then you just immediately compress it, you will only be compressing the things that you just raised during EQ. So you're basically undoing your EQ with your compression and vice versa. There are some reasons to do things in different orders and whatnot, depending on what other processing you have or what problems you're trying to solve, but be mindful of the order in which you're doing this processing so you don't inadvertently create another problem for yourself. And lastly, another way to mess it up is to apply it to too many elements in the mix. If everything is punchy, if everything is out front, and if everything is super detailed, then nothing's important, nothing is punchy, and nothing is super detailed because it's all fighting for the attention of the listener, and that's not really the easiest thing to listen to, and it's not the most pleasing thing to listen to, and it just makes it very difficult to focus as a listener because everything is vying for your focus at that point. Cool. I think that's everything. I hope this was helpful to those that are getting into the realm of audio, both in music and sound design. If you have any questions or want me to go into more detail about anything I talked about in this presentation, please put in the comments below. And yeah, interested to hear what you guys think. Thanks. Bye.